Okay, we are back with another contextualized reading for Beowulf. This will be from Grendel's death to as far as I get. Might get to the end of the poem. I might have to split it up, but let's jump in. So Beowulf has successfully defeated Grendel. He's torn off his arm. Grendel has run away with the presumption that that this was a deadly wound, right? So that he's going to die. So in the Harrot, people are celebrating, and Hrothgar is congratulating Beowulf. And let me get my notes up here on the screen for you all. And then we get the bard singing again, the minstrel, right? And the bard is particularly interested in singing a song from Norse mythology, excuse me, from the Volsung saga. If you wanted to look at it and do some comparison work there. And this is a story of Sigmund, the dragon slayer. Now, this is going to be a kind of foreshadowing, right? Because we know at the end of the book here, Beowulf himself will be fighting a dragon as well. And there's this air of, like Hrothgar is congratulating Beowulf. Beowulf's response to Hrothgar, and then Unferth comes and looks at the arm as well, right? And there's kind of a peace making that's going on between Unferth and Beowulf, because now, of course, Unferth is, eating his own words. We get he's sort of put in place by the arm. So at around 980 here, there was less tampering and big talk then from Unferth the boaster, less of his blather as the Hallthanes eyed the awful proof of the hero's prowess, the splayed hand up under the eaves, every nail, every claw and spur, every spike and welt on the hand of that heathen brute was like barbed steel. Everybody said there was no honed iron hard enough to pierce him through, no time-proofed blade that could cut his brutal blood-caked claw. So again, we don't ever get like a full physical description of Grendel, but this is a very intense focus on this arm that then becomes a trophy. And there's one way that we could settle into just the plot and the narrative of the story itself, but it's a very strange thing if you think about it, right? The keeping of a trophy, this arm. So it's not that they just bury it or are glad to be done with Grendel, but they're keeping something of him on display as well. And this would be something that carries on throughout Euro-Christian culture, despite how nasty it seems. So much so that we've seen it with more recently where I live with Native Americans, the colonizers coming in and committing acts of genocide, and not just acts of genocide, but then the flaying of skin, the keeping of trophies and things like this. Sometimes you hear about it in war stories as well. Something to maybe dig into for research papers. We get a reference around the year line 1000 to souls. And I wanted to point this out because this is another Christian concept, just the idea of a soul itself showing up. The text says, only the roof remained unscathed by the time the guilt-fouled fiend turned tail in despair of his life. But death is not easily escaped from by anyone. All of us with souls, earth dwellers and children of men, must make our way to a destination already ordained, where the body, after the banqueting, sleeps on its deathbed. So this kind of speculation on the preordained and fated sense of the world that we all die, but also the distinction of some beings having souls. And we get a shift to the victory feast here. Inside the Hera, there was nothing but friendship. The shielding nation was not yet familiar with feud and betrayal. Then Halfdane's son presented Beowulf with a gold standard as a victory gift, an embroidered banner, also breastmail and a helmet, and a sword carried high that was both precious object and token of honor. So Beowulf drank his drink at ease. It was hardly ashamed to be showered with such gifts in front of the hall troops. There haven't been many moments, I'm sure, when men exchanged for such treasures at so friendly a sitting. So a couple of things just to think about in the text there. That there's an allusion to some sort of feuding or family feuding that is going to happen later on here. The poet tells us that the shielding nation was not yet familiar with betrayal. But we know there's been other drama, right? And there's something going on with Unferth as well. These allusions to the fact that he has slain his brother, two of his brothers, right? And that will be a distinction that Beowulf himself makes, that he's not somebody who kills his own kin. So this seems to be part of the medieval context, especially among different groups that have been intermarrying with each other across channels, from Sweden over into Denmark, further up in Sweden, because the Beowulf and the Geats are from this kind of the southern tip of Sweden, but they distinguish themselves as different from the Swedes in the text as well. So there's been this kind of intermarrying, and then later on, of course, we know that the poet is writing this down around the year 1000, and that this is being written down in England, and so there have been invasions into England, and there have been all sorts of conflicts. So contextually, there is this kind of pushing away from kinslaying. And of course, that's going to be distinguishing Beowulf greatly from Grendel, right? Because Grendel is of the lineage of Cain, right, who has killed his brother in the Hebrew Old Testament, right? Or what the Christians call the Old Testament anyway. In Hebrew, it's the Pentateuch or the Tanakh. So we then get another story from the bard here, and this then becomes the story of the saga of Finn and his sons, unfolding the tale, as the text says, of the fierce attack on Friesland, where Knaf, the king of the Danes, met death. And so this story ends up being about Hildebert, a Danish prince who then intermarries, but there has been conflict, and then she returns to the Geats. And so this is, I think, alluding to, it shows some compositional elements to the text itself, as the epic is not just the story of Beowulf, but again and again we're seeing allusions to larger sagas and also to just stories within stories. And so those stories are doing this kind of commentary on the situation for Beowulf himself. In the middle of the song here, and this is something that's one of the nice things I think about the Seamus Heaney text, is that it sets off the singing aside to show the kind of story within a story, and its italics and stuff. So there Their own ring giver, after all, was dead and gone. They were leaderless and forced allegiance to his murderer. So if any Frisians stirred up bad blood with insinuations or taunts about this, the blade of the sword would arbitrate it. And so, as a way to try to be a peacemaker or a peace weaver, after a bloody battle, Hildebert ordered her own son's body to be burnt with Hanaf's, the flesh on his bones, to sputter and blaze beside his uncle's. The woman wailed and sang keenes. The warrior went up. Carcass flame swirled and fumed. They stood round the burial mound and howled as heads melted, crusted gashes spattered and ran bloody matter. The glutton element flamed and consumed the dead of both sides. So again, we get a funeral that is a pyre. And so this is alluding to pagan elements, right? Because the Christians believed that their body was going to rise again with the second coming. And so the Christians didn't want to burn their bodies. And of course, there are different theologies for, just what exactly part of that physical body comes back. So, but at least for the time period, it ends up being a distinction for between Christians and pagans. I'm skipping a little bit. So there's been this feud. It's not necessarily settled by the marriage, and then the Danes come seek revenge. And kill Finn, and then of course the princess returns. On page, this is around a line 1160 or so. The hall ran red with blood of enemies. Finn was cut down, the queen brought away, and everything the shieldings could find inside Finn's walls, the Frisian king's gold collars and gemstones, swept off to their ship, over sea lanes, then back to Daneland. The warrior troop bore that lady home. And so we just want to think as we're reading the text, like why that story, why those two stories that we've just heard from the bard after Beowulf has defeated Grendel. And then we turn back to the narrator here, right? The poem was over. The poet had performed. A pleasant murmur started on the benches. Stewards did the rounds with wine in splendid jugs, and Wealhtheow came to sit in her gold crown between two good men, uncle and nephew, each one of whom still trusted each other, and the forthright Unferth admired by all for his mind and courage, although under a cloud for killing his brothers, reclined near the king. And so we've had just a story about uncles and nephews, and then the image turns to Unferth. We don't really get a whole lot of the backstory here, but here Unferth is admired by people, but at the same time he's under this cloud for having killed brothers. The queen speaks and says, "Enjoy this drink, my most generous lord. Raise up your goblet, entertain the Geats, duly and gently discourse with them. Be open-handed, happy and fond. Relish their company, but recollect as well all of the boons that have been bestowed on you. The bright court of Herat has been cleansed, and now the word is that you want to adopt this warrior as a son. So, while you may, bask in your fortune, and then bequeath kingdom and nation to your kith and kin before your decease. I'm certain that Hrothulf, he is noble and will use the young ones well. He will not let you down. Should you die before him, he will treat our children truly and fairly. He will honor, I am sure, our two sons. Repay them in kind when he recollects all good things we gave him once, the favor and the respect he found in his childhood." And so there's this question of the transfer of power, right? This is a theme throughout so much literature, down through many of the Shakespeare plays. Uh, she then turns to the bench where her boys sat, Hrethric and Hrothmund, with the noble's sons, all the youth together, and that good man Beowulf the Geat sat between the brothers. And then we get references to Higelac. Of course, this is Beowulf's uncle. So again, that theme of like nephew and uncle showing up in the text. Um, we're told Higelac the Geat, grandson of Swerding, wore this neck ring on his last raid. At bay under his banner, he defended the booty treasure he had won. Fate swept him away because of his proud need to provoke a feud with the Frisians. He fell beneath his shield in the same gem-crusted kingly gear he had won when he crossed the frothing wave vat. So the dead king fell into Frankish hands. So this is like alluding to things that happen later on, right? Um, uh, which is interesting. And but we see that some of these objects that are being passed back and won and gifted have been uh, worn by other people who've been defeated. That sometimes you could be in a hall and you could see somebody wearing something that was worn by a family member of yours. And this is something that disturbs Beowulf, as we will see. Um, but nevertheless, uh, uh, at this moment, where everybody's applauding Beowulf and Wealhtheow, and I think this is a big moment. Again, in my last lecture, I mentioned the idea of a peace weaving, right? And this came from my own Anglo-Saxon professor, Alexandra Olson, or Alki, as we called her affectionately. That there is much more than serving going on, right? With Wealhtheow, she's serving and she's keeping peace. That could be a very tenuous peace between some of these feuds that are freshly fought, right? And not only that, there's designs for where people sit and in between people. So there's a lot of conscientiousness that we're seeing show up in what will become courtly life. Applause filled the hall. Wealhtheow pronounced the presence of the company. Take delight in this torque, dear Beowulf. Wear it for luck, and wear also this mail from our people's armory. May you prosper in them. Be acclaimed for strength, for kindly guidance to these two boys, and your bounty will be sure. You have won renown. You are known to all men, far and near, and now and forever. Your sway is wide as the wind's home, as the sea around the cliffs. And so, my prince, I wish you a lifetime's luck and blessings to enjoy this treasure. Treat my sons with tender care. Be strong and kind. Here, each comrade is true to the other. Loyal lord, loving in spirit. The thanes have one purpose. The people are ready, having drunk and pledged. The ranks do as I bid. We get this reference to fate then. She moves to her place. Men were drinking wine in the rare feast. How could they know fate, the grim shape of things to come, the threat looming over many thanes as night approached, and King Hrothgar prepared to retire to his quarters? Retainers in great numbers were posted on the guard, and as so often in the past, benches were pushed back, bedding gear and bolsters spread across the floor, and one man lay down to rest, already marked for death. And so again, this is just like helpful imagery, just to see the practice, right? This isn't like a big mansion or a massive castle with like a lot of different rooms and bed chambers. There might be separate chambers for some people, and we are told that, of course, Beowulf is not in the room when Grendel's mother comes. In the scene that we're about to get to, but most people are sleeping in the hall. They're like rolling out their beds, mats, and they're putting the benches and tables aside. Um, skipping through some of my notes here. When we see fate being associated with Grendel's mother, I think this is a particularly interesting thing. Um, so uh, the connection to Cain shows up again around lines 1258 to 1267. And then we get an interesting comparison that Seamus Heaney gives to, he uses the term Amazon. And I was wondering when I was rereading this, because this is obviously not an Anglo-Saxon word and not necessarily an Anglo-Saxon concept. The stories of fighting with Amazons, of course, comes from Greek mythology, or Mediterranean mythology, more broadly speaking. And so I went back and I looked at the text, and my grammar is not very good anymore for figuring things out in Anglo-Saxon. But so I was just looking at each word here in the Seamus Heaney text. So here's the Old English. Was se guira lassa ethnis swa mikla swabith mantha craft wig weir weefs be weapned men thon hero bunden hamera gethruren swerd swat fa swin over herm equium ditig andweard skireth. And so I have in this really bad translation just the words, right? Her So we get horror, and there is this kind of nation, a reference to a kind of nation, but the word Amazon doesn't show up. War horror women. And so you can see why someone like a poet like Heaney would go there. But what I want people to be thinking about is the consequences and what happens in the process of translation and what sorts of concepts that we bring in, because this idea of Amazon women as an entire group of women warriors kind of already others them. And what we see throughout Norse writing is that there are women warriors are normal. They're not necessarily some exotic thing in the Icelandic, or not only Icelandic, but just Norse culture in general. And so we see women, we see Valkyries, we see a lot of war capabilities for women. And so want to be careful of just thinking about what concepts we might be bringing or what happens in the process of translation itself. And so when we go back here, now back to that story of Hildebert, that and Finn, we hear a little bit more of this conflict. And so I've said this already, that of course the poems being written down around the year 1000. Finn the Frisian. So this is what the minstrel was singing about. Finn the Frisian is recorded as an Anglo-Saxon ancestor in Historia Brittonum. And so there might be a sense that for the hearers or the audience of the Beowulf poet around the year 1000, that the Beowulf poet is kind of trying to point back to something that might be a way to bridge or pacify divisions between the Danes, the people under Danelaw living in England at the time, and then the Anglo-Saxons as well, right? So some of these old stories might be doing that type of work. In the text itself, and the word here is intertextuality, right? So we get allusions there. There are people in the audience would know more of the songs that we hear in some more of the Norse legends and mythology in general. So the poet can just allude to things and create context for the hearers that we don't necessarily have approaching the text today. So in the story, Finn tries to make peace as a ring giver to Danes who'd lost one of their warriors, Hnaf. They were leaderless and forced allegiance to his murderer, as I read earlier. So if any Frisian stirred up bad blood with his insinuations or taunts about this, the blade of the sword would arbitrate it. Hildebert has her own son's body burnt with Hnafs. This is meant to be a peace gesture. And then violence arises again. Finn is slain. Hildebert returns home. The poem then shifts back to Wealhtheow, the peace weaver, right? There's the drama with Unferth that I just mentioned a minute ago. And then there's a transfer over to the gifts that Beowulf is going to be giving to his own uncle, who then later dies fighting the Frisians. So all of that is being woven together quite skillfully, I think, by the Beowulf poet here. And then we get the torque that's gifted to Beowulf. And so when we're thinking about this all in context, we got to think about the conflicts and alliances back in Denmark during presumably around the 500s, right? But the listeners to the written text were in England during times of renewed conflict with the Danes. So I think that that's important for cultural context to think about what's going on historically for the time that the text is being written down. And so when we think back to this is about the year 1000, right? If you think back to major characters in history like William the Confessor and Harold are referred to as the last of the Anglo-Saxon line of kings that start in the 800s, and we get Alfred, and towards the end of the 800s, just about to the year 900, is Alfred's life and his reign there, and then we get about a century of continuous Anglo-Saxon rule, but there's of course conflicts throughout and renewed conflicts closer to the year 1000 with people under Danelaw or the Vikings. So by the time we get to 1066, there's an invasion of England from the north, from the Normans, right? The Northmen, who were other Viking groups that had settled in Normandy and in some cases, married in with Frankish people and Frankish princes. And there's close relations as well across the channel, but we see that with William the Confessor and Harold II, who's only, I mean, it's like not even the whole year. Harold II gets to be king, but then he's almost immediately dethroned. So these are the last Anglo-Saxon kings before the Norman invasion in 1066. We can see the point I'm trying to make here is that power is pretty precarious at the time. While the narrator of the written Beowulf is indeed a Christian, there's nothing to suggest that Anglo-Saxon rule was uncontested or fixed. So the poem, I think, is really trying to assuage fears and make Danish lore and Danish people more familiar. I think that is part of the work that's going on with the poet here. Which I think is very politically charged and heavy lifting to be doing during times of precarious power and conflict. So back to Grendel's mother, and Grendel's mother in this context then is especially estranged, right there, because Grendel's family, of course, is going to go back to that connection with Cain. And this is where the Euro-Christian part of the context is showing up as well, because the more that the Euro-Christians want to sort of push against pagan culture, but also push against Cain, right, which actually comes from Jewish culture, right? So, but Cain being the bearing the mark of God and for having murdered his own brother, becomes this way of aligning everything that is evil, right? So if we're dealing with monsters and monstrosity, there's a really great book by Jeffrey Cohen. I'm staring at it over there on my shelf. that deals with monster theory in it, and he's got like nine bullet points or something that are really useful for people who are into to thinking about monsters. And a monster isn't necessarily human, but there's always something sort of recognizable about them in the shape, in the form of their bodies, right? So the question of humanness or humanity is not necessarily, especially at this time, not even like biology is not even on the kind of map for these people, and all of that stuff is going to come later. So there's a connection to Cain, and there's also this connection to fate that keeps showing up in that passage I have in my notes here. That, and again, this is not a grammatical translation at all. But there's this reference also to the boar ridge or the sword swine on the helmet. And I pulled a picture of this. This is something, an animal form that was often associated with going to war among the Viking people. And so this helmet, I just pulled this image, I think from Wikipedia, that has this, but there are lots of instances of that. So, as I mentioned here, the Amazon does a kind of othering. The context of the poem is situating Grendel and his mother as monsters, but they're also descendants of Cain. So they're monsters, but they're also human in this one kind of recognizable way. There's a lot of ambiguity around it. So then Beowulf, in a very inhuman act, if you ask me, Beowulf makes a trophy out of Grendel's arm, and then his mother takes it on her way out. And so not only is she outraged at having lost her son, but she is taking that part of the body back. Interestingly, though, the text tells us that Hrothgar knows that this is Grendel's mother. So there is some familiarity that these Danish people seem to have. We get descriptions of her walking the moors with her son around lines at 1147. We're told they are fatherless strangers who haunt a strange and hostile land. They live in a lake of unknown depth where the water burns at night. And with typical understatement that happens in the text, that is no good place. We're told in 1372. So Beowulf consoles Hrothgar after this attack and bolsters him up, invoking the heroic code. He says it's better to avenge than to sulk. They find Ashera's severed head when they go out looking, and we get toward the lake where the water is infested with reptiles. Unferth then lends Beowulf a sword he named Hrunting. And so we see this, and we've already kind of seen this with the gifting of war objects, that objects can carry auras during this period. Maybe that continues today for some people. I have a friend who she's a guitar player and she's named her guitar. So I guess that sort of thing happens. Beowulf gives Hrothgar instructions in case of his death and to deliver his treasure to his uncle and to secure his fame. And so we get a little bit of Beowulf's intentions there. If I die, what I need is to have this stuff go, so that my people can know that I proved myself. He then dives into the mirror, and we get a kind of blur here, something almost psychological in the way that depth is being treated in the text. It takes him, according to the text, the better part of a day to get to the bottom. So obviously we're in a kind of like fantasy type of situation. And then there seems to be an underground type of cave that Beowulf gets to. We get a shift to Grendel's mother's perspective. She then attacks, and Beowulf's sword fails. So Hrunting fails. And then Beowulf gets another one from a hoard of treasure that he can see stored up in this cave. and it appears to be from a time of giants. And so we get, again, this is something that shows up in a lot of ancient cultures about a time of giants before a flood. But that flood story also gets kind of mixed with the flood story that shows up in Genesis, right? But of course, we know, those of us who study ancient texts, we know that the flood stories um, uh, uh, happen across various cultures in the world. People make wild speculations about ancient civilizations that I'm not going to entertain in this particular lecture. But of course, we know that it's very specifically to the Genesis or Old Testament story, that the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Mesopotamian epic, is what is being moved in to the Hebrew text as well, right? And we know that the Hebrews have lived in exile in Babylon and come back, and it's in the period after coming back from Babylon that they begin writing what will become the Old Testament for the Christians, or the Tanakh for Jews. So all of that to say is to say that intertextuality is sort of working and interweaving different cultures, have asymmetrical presences within various traditions at various different times. So giants show up here. We've definitely, at this moment in the text, I think, traveled into the mythological instead of the historical time here. And this is something that shows up in a lot of ancient texts as well. It shows up even in Herodotus, the great Greek historian, that there's a time, a mythical time, and then there's the time of humans and the time of history. And that is when that human time comes in that we get something more linear. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't lots of humans cultures in the world that don't necessarily work in that linear framing. So, like, for example, like Native American cultures do not think in that linear way, but the Greek and then especially the Christian traditions tend to frame not only history as working in a linear way, but also history as working within this idea of a rationalized kind of plan or scope or providence, as the Christians call it. And that we see that kind of stamp being put into this story itself, right? That people are fated to die, but there is some sort of an entity that knows this. We might not know it, but it has all been planned out, right? That's what the text keeps telling us over and over again. We see that unlike her son Grendel, Grendel's mom, who is never named, interestingly, she uses a knife. But Beowulf's chainmail that was given to him by Wealhtheow, of course, protects him. After he strikes down Grendel's mother with the giant sword, he then beheads Grendel's body. And so there's this beheading tit for tat going on, right, with Asherah, the person whose head they found. And now he's going to take another trophy back to show that he's accomplished, he's finished the job. Meanwhile, back on shore, they are about to give up. They think that Beowulf has lost. Then Beowulf has this moment where he sees the sword that he's struck Grendel's mother with, and then beheaded Grendel with, that the sword itself melts. Beowulf then returns with the hilt of the sword, but no blade. The text says it was a task of 4 to hoist Grendel's head on a spear and bear it under strain to the great hall. Grendel's head was then hauled by the hair, dragged across the floor where the people were drinking, a horror for both queen and company to behold. They stared in awe. It was an astonishing sight. And we want to be very clear here, right? Because like many stories, we read and align with a protagonist, but this is some brutality that is happening. Like and so something will um, be looking at an essay for some of my classes called "Civilized Rage" in Beowulf by a couple of authors, perhaps later on. And that's something I just invite anybody to be thinking about with the text. What is the role of grudges? What is the role of revenge? What is the role of rage? When we see this stuff, it's like the hatred has been carried over well past the fight here to put this person's head on display, or the monster's head. Um, Beowulf recounts the battle. Then the sword hilt seems to have mythical qualities. It shows a war. There's a story that's kind of on it, that it shows a war and then a flood that destroyed the races of giants. Hrothgar then praises Beowulf, contrasting him to King Heremod. He says, it is a great wonder how Almighty God in his magnificence favors our race with rank and scope and the gift of wisdom. His sway is wide. So again, even though we've just had this kind of references to these times of the giants, what we get is that the text kind of shifts very heavy-handedly to this monotheistic perspective of the Almighty God. So Euro-Christian worldview places man above other creatures as well. So we're not only just seeing God's plan, we're seeing that according to Hrothgar, God favors humans above other animals. Definitely something that I would call part of the Euro-Christian worldview. The other cultures don't necessarily place humans on top of a sort of hierarchy of beings in nature. Hrothgar warns Beowulf that too much pride reverses to grief, and that strength doesn't last, like the strength of youth doesn't last. So we're getting some advice. Beowulf returns the sword fronting to Unferth. He asks Hrothgar for leave to go home. He says that Hrethric, or Hrothgar's son, will find favor among the Geats if he ever comes to visit. So there's been this establishment and a bond of friendship that's been fixed here. And then we're told what you have done is to draw two peoples, the Geat nation and the neighboring Danes, into shared peace and a pact of friendship in spite of hatreds we've harbored in the past. And so we see that kind of peacemaking work being done. The Geats then take their leave. Hrothgar intuits that he'll never see Beowulf again. The Geats go home to meet Queen Hygd, who's young and a peace weaver. And then the poet immediately contrasts her with Queen Modruth, who perpetrated terrible wrongs. And so that we see this as part of the poet's technique, is to introduce a character and then to have another character contrast. In literary terminology, the term is a foil, right? When you have another character whose presence is really just to sort of bring out or highlight particular qualities in a more developed character. Sometimes they're called stock characters, right? They're just there, but they don't really change or have much going on, as opposed to like a protagonist, which often has a dynamic or a changing character, right? The queen, we get a little bit of insight here on the role of queens, right? A queen should weave peace, not punish the innocent with loss of life for imagined insults. Then we get Hygelac welcoming Beowulf, and he inquires of the journey. And Beowulf then mentions Grendel's family again. So we get another description. He says, no earthly offspring of Grendel's need ever boast of that bout before dawn. no matter how long the last of his evil family survives. So, yes, he has killed Grendel and the mother, but apparently there may be other family members out there. We get mention of Freyarwaru, Hrothgar's daughter, and this is really interesting because she didn't really show up in the text when Beowulf was over in Denmark at the Harrod, but we see from this exchange with Higelac that Beowulf the whole time was gathering intelligence. He was on a kind of mission that of military importance, right? To create that pact of friendship and peace, yes, and to establish himself as a hero in the world, yes. But he's also bringing back information to Higelac here. Something really important for the depth and the complexity of the text, because sometimes people have thought about this early epic as just being about warmongering, sort of bloodthirsty violence. There's a lot of violence in it as well, but there's quite a bit more in terms of dimensionality once we really start digging into the text a little bit. So we get this mention of Freyarwaru. Who is betrothed to Ingeld, and Beowulf then says, but generally the spear is prompt to retaliate when a prince is killed, no matter how admirable the bride may be. So he then speculates about that this is a tenuous peace. He's suspicious of the Heathobards. We see Beowulf was gathering intelligence the whole time he was with the Danes. He then his recounting of Grendel's attack highlights anthropophagy, or human eating. I'm not using the term cannibal here because that is a later term. It's a corruption of cannab or carib from actually native peoples in the Caribbean. Cannibalism as a concept, that human eating concept and the fear of it, is something that the Euro-Christian colonizers bring with them from their own mythologies as they come to invade the what is now called the Caribbean and the Americas. So the concept that couldn't exist at the time, right, of a cannibal, the concept of human eating or anthropophagy, yes, but cannib as a word just wasn't in existence at the time. So there's more description here of Grendel, and we see that he's been wearing a gloomy pouch, right? So there is intelligence, there is a kind of humanity to him. Yes, he is like one of if we go all the way back, if we're thinking in Euro-Christian terms, to Adam and Eve, he's still a member of the race, but he's been cast off because of Cain's killing of his own brother, right? So Grendel carried a pouch. There's another reference here in the text to cremation, which shows pagan practices, as I've said. Beowulf then presents treasures to Higelac, his uncle. And there's a strange shift in the narrative here where we see the first person show up. So I said in an earlier lecture, part of what epic storytelling does is it often operates in the third person, and it's telling some sort of a history, usually of battles, the establishment of a particular kind of political order. But we get a couple of times in the text itself a first person narrator. I heard 4 horses were handed over next. Beowulf bestowed 4 bay steeds to go with the armor, swift gallopers all alike. Then the I heard continues as a kind of refrain showing up there. Beowulf gives gifts to Hygd, the queen, as well. Then we get this strange commentary on the reverse perceptions of Beowulf. So this is a really interesting moment, I think, in the text. From 2180 to 2190, we're told that people thought that at home, people thought that Beowulf was like full of himself, that he wasn't going to prove himself, and they were suspicious of him. And so now when we think back to those kind of challenges that Unferth had to Beowulf earlier in the text, there might be a little bit more to it than that he was kind of a ne'er-do-well or something, and he had to go out to prove himself. Beowulf then is rewarded by his uncle with gifts and with land. We're told that he gets 7,000 hides, and a hall and a throne. Now, if you look up what a hide is, how much land a hide is, it shows you might get a definition like 120 acres. It was probably quite a bit smaller in the medieval time that the poem is being written in, but still 7,000, even if it was a 1 acre plot, like 7,000 is a lot of land. And what we're seeing is a fascination with land and power, and that's something that Euro Christians, again, when they move out into the world, they are going to be obsessed with the idea of land and personally owning land. So both owned land by birth in that country. So Beowulf already had some land, ancestral grands, but the greater right and sway were inherited by the higher born. So we're starting to get again the not only the owners of land, but particularly nobility as landowners. We haven't quite entered the feudal era yet, but we're getting close to it. The narrator says eventually that the whole kingdom belonged to Beowulf after others died. He rules for about 50 winters. Then a dragon appears, wakened with his trove by someone who stole a gem-studded goblet. It was desperation on the part of a slave. So we see slavery exists, right? Fleeing the heavy hand of some master, guilt-ridden and on the run, going to ground. Now, oftentimes slaves were captured from different conquests, right? But here, a slave has run away, but then found this treasure trove and goes back and takes a piece of it, probably to win, to not be killed. The treasure was buried long ago, we're told, by a highborn race. So again, this kind of allusion to an older mythical age. We then get the speech of the one who buried the treasure, who has lost his race, and he's the last of them and buries all of this stuff. Then the dragon came and guarded it for 3 centuries. This kind of idea, if you haven't already noticed, it shows up in The Hobbit. The idea that dragons are obsessed with treasure and gold, and they count it. And so, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, great Anglo-Saxon scholar that he was drawing on all this stuff. And I want my people watching and listening to these lectures to really think that this is where Tolkien is getting it, right? This is the popularity of The Hobbit. Just because of that, I think Beowulf remains a super important text. So there's this moment, though, of critical reflection that disturbs Beowulf. When he's had all these lands, like he hasn't been overly ambitious. People have died out, and then he just inherited the land. He didn't try to conquer more. So the text is at pains to emphasize that aspect. That he's ambitious. Like it's okay to have ambition, but it is not okay to become this tyrant who seeks to control everything. But nevertheless, he's inherited lands from other people who've made poorer choices. And he starts to wonder whether or not, now that this dragon has come and is destroying his land, he says, did I do something wrong, right? Did I make God mad in some sort of way? He wonders if he's broken a commandment. So a kind of self-questioning shows up here. we then get a depiction of Higelac's death by the Frisians. And again, that's that kind of contrasting of characters, right? Um, Beowulf returned from the battle victorious. Hygd had offered Beowulf the throne, but Beowulf refused to usurp her son Herdred. Then exiles or sons of Ohtere arrived who had rebelled against their king. They then overtook Herdred, and Beowulf inherited the kingdom. And again, we get this reference all the way back. If you think back to the beginning lines of the poem, we get he was a good king. That was a good king, right? And it's understatement, right? That again, that he was the greatest. We don't get like he was the greatest king ever to have lived, and like the most greatest of the greatest. Not a lot of superlatives going on here, just the straight understatement. Beowulf then takes 11 soldiers to confront the dragon. There's that reference to 11. With him it makes 12. So there's this kind of an allusion to the apostles of Christ there as well. He'd learned of the slave's story, and then he took the cup with him. Beowulf then senses his own death coming, and he sits down to think. I do like these moments of the text where he is reflective in his old age. Did I live a good life? Did I break one of God's commandments? Those sorts of things show him to be a much more complex character than, that he sometimes gets shown as on the TV tales of Beowulf or the Vikings shows. He addresses his comrades. He reflects on his life. He recalls sibling slayings, Alliance 2430 to 2440. And these may parallel some Anglo-Saxon happenings, I think. And if I want to actually dig into that moment of the text at 2430, because this is where he's going to distinguish himself. He's kind of talking himself into being able to go into battle with this. So he says, King Hrethel kept me and took care of me, was open-handed. Excuse me. Behaved like a kinsman. While I was his ward, he treated me no worse as a ween about the place than one of his own boys. Heribald and Hathkin, or my own Hygelac, which of course is his uncle. For the eldest, Heribald, an unexpected deathbed was laid out through a brother's doing, when Hathkin bent his horn-tipped bow and loosed the arrow that destroyed his life. He shot wide and buried a shaft in the flesh and blood of his own brother. So even though it was an accident, it was like a hunting accident, it's still the killing of a family member that kind of wreaks its own undoing. And there are instances of this in actual English history of English royalty, sometimes where accidents can happen out in the woods as well. So there might be some other allusions going on to the poet, but we don't, like I said, we don't know exactly the year this is written down. He then makes a last boast that he's going to kill the dragon. And he distinguishes again. He says, I'm not, we see later, a little bit later on, he will say, I didn't kill any of my kin. I wasn't a kinslayer. And then again, that's supposed to just set him up in distinction, especially with Grendel and the whole tribe of Cain, of course. He says he wishes that he didn't have to take weapons to fight the dragon, and that he could fight like Grendel, but he can't. He says fate will decide. I am resolved. And I have in my notes here to talk a little bit about angst and about Heidegger, who's a 20th century German philosopher with a lot of nasty politics. If you ask me, he was very anti-Semitic, and he was a Nazi, but nevertheless a very important and influential philosopher. If you've heard of the movement, or sometimes people call existentialism, right? Existential phenomenology. And Heidegger is famous for talking about this returning to questions of ontology in philosophy, which is the study of the nature of existence, or what it means to be, which had been dealt with in early Greek philosophy, but then kind of like through Plato and stuff, it had kind of been a discussion that was set aside. And he returns to it in the early 20th century, following his own teacher, Edmund Husserl. And he reflects on being. He's also been influenced a little bit by some concepts from the Far East as well, in the Book of Tea, if you ever want to think about that. So the moderns were, even though these are Euro-Christian people, they're also being influenced by other cultures around the world. But Heidegger starts to characterize life as what he calls being toward death, that we are, as humans, aware on some level of the fact that we are going to die. We don't know necessarily when we're going to die. And because we don't know when we're going to die, we can develop a fear of death or anxiety around the whole idea of life and have I lived a good life, right? And we see that there's this moment of anxiety that Beowulf has had in the text here. Heidegger believes that the answer to existential angst, or that feeling of like, have I lived a good life, is to go fully into something. And so he, and there are lots of other German thinkers at the time, are really trying to understand the notion of the hero. Later on, Joseph Campbell will write his hero's journey stuff. There's a lot of just speculation going on in the 1920s in Germany about heroes and mythological time. And Heidegger says that the way to live a life that isn't in bad faith is to live authentically. And what that means is to sort of gather one's own self up and do something with full commitment. Now, you can see how this would align with fascist politics as well, right? So there's a lot of that fascination with heroic culture that gets woven right into the mythologies of fascism that were so rampant at the time as well, and populist movements. That there's almost a moving away from reflection and into just doing something in the moment. The word authentic, if you look at the really, really old versions of the word, it's a Greek word. And it literally means the one who kills with one's own hand. So, and there's particularly in Greek culture, there's an association that you've killed a family member as well, right? And so when you think about ancient Greek tragedies and things, it's always, oftentimes it's like has involved some sort of overthrowing of a parasite, right? Like the killing of a father or something like that, as rampant throughout that kind of mythology. But for Heidegger, the sense of being authentic, and it's something I want students to just be thinking about in their own lives, and the notion of authenticity, and whether or not, what we definitely place a value on that in our culture, but is there a kind of violence that comes in our culture with the ways that we value that notion of authenticity? The one who kills with one's own hand, is there always a kind of violence? One of Heidegger's own students, a Jewish thinker named Emmanuel Levinas, spends his whole career sort of pushing back on Heidegger on the question of ontology. And he says that we need to, rather than asking, even before we can ask the question of what it means to exist or what a good life is or any of that sort of stuff, we're already in relation to other people. We've already been depending on our relationships with others. And so for Levinas, ethics must be first philosophy. Those are the fundamental questions rather than that question of what the meaning of life is itself. So those are some more recent thinkers, but I think that they're useful when we're reflecting back onto moments in the text, and especially representations that just want to present Beowulf as a kind of jock who's just like the hero who's like full of his rage and his ass kicking that he's capable of doing. He, but nevertheless, he boasts. He's puffing himself up, and I use that metaphor especially if we look at this essay about civilized rage, that the word Belgun or Belguan in Old English, you can hear it in the word belch, right? Burp, right? But it's one of the words about sort of that's used throughout the text that is this alludes to this kind of swelling up of rage to get yourself in the zone for going into battle. A lot of times in TV shows, there's like a speech that somebody gives to rile up the troops. And we see that in Old English poems like the Battle of Maldon, for example, is one of them, composed around the same time that this version of Beowulf is being written down. Wiglaf then is the only one who stays behind, right? The rest of Beowulf's soldiers desert him. He's pushed back by the dragon. Again, we have the theme of the sword failing. Then we get some of Wiglaf's own family history. And we've seen that Beowulf did not have like a father. Beowulf was taken in and adopted himself as well, right? And so we see that there's possibly this kind of transfer of power going to go on here. Then we get Wiglaf's loyalty speech. The dragon attacks again. The second sword fails. And then Beowulf, we see Beowulf doesn't really have good luck with weapons. There's something about him that that wants to like see, or his strength, or what makes him so great is something more intrinsic to him, and his own strength and his own body. Beowulf, the dragon bites Beowulf in the neck. Wiglaf then stabs the belly, and as the dragon is reacting to that, then Beowulf is able to recover enough, and then to give a deadly blow with a knife. Beowulf then is poisoned, and he gives his death speech, and he says this, and I've mentioned this a few times earlier: all this consoles me, doomed as I am, sickening for death, because of my right ways the ruler of mankind need never blame me when the breath leaves my body for murder of kinsmen. That's what he seems to be concerned with, and also gestures towards the monotheistic God. So he then sends Wiglaf to observe the hoard of treasure. When Wiglaf comes back, Beowulf requests that a monument be erected to him called Beowulf's Barrow. So Wiglaf rebukes then the deserters. He predicts of violence about to come in Beowulf's death. He reports to others on the ridge what has happened. And he says, now war is looming over our nation. Soon it will be known to the Franks and the Frisians far and wide that the king is gone. They make a pyre, which shows a pagan funeral, and then they make a monument with ashes from it in it. And that is basically the story of Beowulf. Now I'm going to go on in another lecture and talk about this essay from around 2004. And it's really just to like show people what scholars do in their writing as well. It's not to just pick this. The essay is called "Civilized Rage and Beowulf" by Thomas Weimer and Aaron Labby, and it's available online if you want to look it up and read it as well. So I'll have some things to say about that, but that's mostly if you're thinking about these lectures in terms of the studying of texts and textuality as well. So, you might be watching this just because you wanted to understand the contextualized reading for Beowulf itself. But once we transfer over into thinking about what other scholars have argued, then the discussion, of course, gets richer. But my point isn't to say that these people have the end all be all of something to say about the poem Beowulf. It's really just to sort of walk through some of the moves that they make, particularly around the idea of civilization, since that is a very loaded term that comes to be highly prized by people of, as I call them, the Euro-Christian culture, all lowercase, all one word. So the ideas of what civilization is. And it's been often commented on with Beowulf that the heret, or the heart, right, of the hall that's being protected is this moment of civilization. And it's that aligning of the throne with God. When, remember, Grendel can't quite approach the throne. So this is about, for some people historically, the importance of Beowulf has been about the way that even though it has this tragic ending where Beowulf has died and we're not going to see a king like him again, he's still a kind of culture hero in the sense that he has founded or protected something like civilization, particularly from these monsters who are othered as being somehow less than human, or in the dragon's case, an entirely different kind of creature. Um, I'm going to stop there and maybe pick up in another lecture with Civilized Rage and Beowulf by Weimer and Aaron Labby. If you want to follow along there, that's fine. If not, you might just check it out as a place. It's easy online. You don't have to go through academic journals or through libraries to read it. Have a great day. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you another time.